Hey, everybody. Welcome into an all-new episode of the Can We Please Talk podcast. As always, I'm Mike Leon.
And filling in for the incomparable Nick Saveri, it's Sabrina Rodriguez.
See, she can't even say incomparable. That's right. We don't even know if Nick is incomparable. On the program.
He is.
Okay, fine. On the program today, a Georgian recap. Nobody better to tell us about everything that happened this past week in Georgia. Sabrina and I on the lessons learned in the runoff and nationally for both parties. Plus, speaking of one of those parties, the former president of the United States had another busy week this week. The Trump org convicted of tax fraud, the Trump team finding a few more loose documents in a West Palm Beach storage unit. It's not mine, folks. More on that later on the program. First, I say hello. I would always say hello to Nick Saveri. Now I think his equal here because Washington Post, Politico, she's been on the show a bunch of different times. How are you doing? She's doing this show from a Georgia hotel room because she's been covering everything happening here in Georgia. How are you doing, Sabrina? Take the audience inside what you've been doing over the last couple of weeks.
Yes, well, last few months at this point, I'm good. We have survived the runoff election. We survived the general election. So I am excited to get to go back home to DC tomorrow. But no, it's been a good run in Georgia and finally over. We got results. We can unpack those.
That's right. And we have a lot to unpack because I want to ask you just at a high level, though. You were obviously down there for so long talking to different people, voters especially. I'm going to play a little sound later on about something I want to get your reaction on. But just at a high level, were you shocked at all in terms of the voter turnout this time in the midterms as opposed to what it was in November? A lot more people came out this time. What were some of your surprises or maybe some things that just were kind of run of the mill that you were like, oh, that's interesting?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't too surprising to see the strong turnout because so many people in Georgia have now been conditioned to this being normal. While for the rest of the country, obviously being from Florida, this is not the norm. The runoff system and all of that, and so many elections in such a short amount of time is not common. But in Georgia, I mean, one of the things that I expected after the general election was sort of like, yeah, there's going to be fatigue. Like people are so tired of seeing like ads nonstop all day about Herschel Walker and Raphael Warnock. But as soon as I started having conversations with people, that was not the case. Hearing people on the ground and voters and people from all walks of life saying, like, no, I get it. I understand the stakes. Like, I might not like the idea that I have to go back and vote, but I know that I have to do it. Or, yeah, I get the point. Like, I have to. It's my responsibility. Or I hate the other candidate, and absolutely, I'm going to go and vote. I mean, people obviously have different motivations for why they still went out to vote for the runoff election, but I think it's made very clear what the stakes are in Georgia. I will say, I think it was surprising to see the differences between the campaigns in the final days of just the number of campaign events and things like that. We got some indication that, Republicans were really worried and that Republicans were feeling like they were going to lose because even like around Thanksgiving, Herschel Walker stopped hosting events. He did like a 5-day stretch where he had no campaign events. And then meanwhile, you saw like the Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock had like nonstop, events and stuff. And for someone that's here and following it on a day-to-day basis, it was like 5 days is a long time and sent a lot of signals for what was going to happen.
Yeah, that is interesting. And obviously, as somebody who follows you on social media, if you don't follow Sabrina, follow her across the different platforms. But you were posting at some of these events and obviously the different people that were coming down the campaign for both candidates. Let's get into the runoff. Overall, I want to play first the sound. If you missed a little bit of Raphael Warnock's acceptance speech and obviously Herschel Walker's concession speech, take a listen to this.
After a hard-fought campaign, you got me for 6 more years. But here's my promise to you. I will walk with you even as I work for you. Because here is what I've learned as a pastor. You can't lead the people unless you love the people. You can't love the people unless you know the people, and you can't know the people unless you walk among the people. You cannot serve me if you cannot see me.
But one of the things I want to tell all of you is you never stop dreaming. I don't want any of you to stop dreaming. I don't want any of you to stop believing in America. I want you to believe in America and continue to believe in the Constitution and believe in our elected officials most of all. Continue to pray for them because all the prayers you've given me, I felt those prayers. I want to thank all my team as well, Team Herschel, because they put up with a lot. I want to thank Team Herschel. Thank all my donors as well, because you guys, without you, I couldn't have done what I've done. So I want to thank all of you as well, because there's no excuses in life. And I'm not going to make any excuses now because we put up one heck of a fight.
I found a lot of that interesting and motivating there on the Warnock side. Obviously, you know why, the tone for both of them. I'm interested. We were just talking about things you were hearing from voters on the ground. There was a poll that we mentioned in the last episode. I had a former TV host that you're familiar with here down in Miami, Rick Sanchez, and Marie Hart, former State Department spokesperson and Fox News contributor. We were talking about some of this stuff playing out, but the poll that we discussed in the last episode was an exit poll, I believe from CNN, which found most of the Herschel Walker voters, about 48% of them, 52% were voting because of Herschel Walker himself. 48% say they were just spiting Raphael Warnock, whereas in reverse, it was 83-17 in favor of Warnock. We've had a bunch of different people on this program kind of analyzing candidates. Matt Brown, who's a colleague of yours, has been on this program as well. But people that have written books that contained Herschel Walker in them, Jeff Perlman, the New York Times bestselling author. And they've all kind of mentioned like Walker was kind of out of his league, right? In terms of like just oration skills and other things with respect to not even being a senator, right? Not really in the politics world. But then you see the final tally, 51.4 to 48.6%. What is, as somebody who was on the ground and saw this and covered this, what are the lessons learned from Georgia on a local level and then that we can apply to the national level? Because this race was still close, even though you hear both candidates there, you hear their tone, and you talk to other people that have covered both of these folks, and they're like, this shouldn't be that close, and yet it was. What does that say to somebody who is covering it?
Well, I could unpack this for days with you, but I mean, I think one of the big things though is it's important to note, you know, Georgia is newly a battleground state. I mean, us having these conversations about Democrats even having the possibility of winning in Georgia and them actually achieving it is not something that like is the norm. You know, like we talk about the swing states that used to be, we talked so much about Florida, or we talked so much about Ohio, and we've seen that those states have shifted red, while Georgia, because of demographic shifts, has just become increasingly of a battleground. I was going to say increasingly Democratic, and it's not to say like now suddenly it's going to be a blue state, but it is just a competitive state where Democrats can play. So it's not necessarily surprising to see these close races. But the part that is surprising is when, yes, you look at, you know, Walker's record. There was so much talk and so many stories in the media about, you know, his past history, allegations of violence, allegations of, you know, he was a staunchly anti-abortion candidate, and him, you know, the allegations that he paid for multiple girlfriends to have abortions, you know, domestic abuse claims, claims that he, you know, questions around whether he even lived in Georgia, because he for decades had lived in Texas and only recently had, you know, moved his voter registration and said that he was living in Georgia. I mean, the list goes on of things that have come up, you know, over his candidacy, of him misrepresenting about himself, that Democrats really seized on. So I think like a big lesson for Republicans that they're grappling with now is the question of candidate quality. You know, at the end of the day, Walker was a candidate that was handpicked by Trump. Trump really pushed for him to run for office. And now there's all the kind of finger pointing in the aftermath of people saying, well, you know, it was built in for him to win. We saw that all these other Republicans won in the state. You know, Governor Brian Kemp, who's also a Republican, won by about 7 points in his race. So they're saying, you know, it was built in. People are frustrated with the president of the United States. People aren't happy with the way that things are going in the country. We should have won this. It shouldn't have been close, and it should have been a Republican win. And now they're really kind of grappling with, okay, well, what is it that's the problem. And a lot of people are landing on that it has things to do surrounding with the former president. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see kind of the soul searching that happens or doesn't happen within the Republican Party right now.
Yeah, I'm very interested in that because I don't see how there will be any soul searching. I mean, if you watched Laura Ingraham last night on Fox News, there was some soul searching done on that panel. I want to ask you something because I saw this. This was another ABC poll of about 4,800 respondents or so. And they made a demographics. They split it into demographics of people that were voting Democrat and Republican. I want to get your response on this because 62% of the people polled in this 4,844 people surveyed, 29% of them were white, 62% were white, right? Of those respondents, 29% voted Democratic, 70% voted Republican. Of the 28% Black respondents, 90% voted Democratic, 8% voted Republican. Of the Hispanic and Latino, 6% of the respondents, 58% Democratic, 39% Republican. Asians, 2% of the respondents, 59% to 39% Democrat to Republican, respectively. And then others, 3%, which was 53 to 41, swinging Democrats to Republicans. I saw this poll, and underneath the poll, it said, white people gonna white people. And it made me laugh. But then you kind of dive into the numbers a little bit more and the makeup of Georgia. What does this say to you about the demographics and the shift of Georgia? Because the big talking point during the night, if you were watching election coverage, I know you were covering it, but across the networks were the large counties that were in the metro areas that still had precincts reporting in and would still have votes trickling in that make up Black and brown, right? And that's where Warnock would eventually take the lead. There was a point where Walker actually took the lead around 10:30 p.m. if you were following across the linear networks. And then all of a sudden, everyone, somehow it went to Warnock. And of course, there was mass confusion on a certain right-wing echo chamber. But what does that say to you about the makeup of the respondents in that poll? That's a pretty large sample size of folks across different ethnicities and genders. And all of a sudden, you see that white people starkly voted for Republican and everybody else was mostly Democratic. What does that say to you?
I mean, and it tracks with what we've seen, and it's tracked to what we've seen in recent elections. And even me thinking of like the exit polls that we saw in the general election in November. I mean, those numbers like match, which shows that it's not something that like radically shifted in this election or, you know, like in the last month, you know, Warnock changed the game and built a different coalition. I mean, it shows that Democrats, their future, their prospects, where their biggest area of growth is with voters of color. I mean, that's just what we see baked into the data, is seeing, you know, to be able to win. And it's not just a Georgia specific thing, but across the country. I mean, for Democrats to be able to win, they need to have extremely strong Black turnout. They have to have, you know, very strong turnout amongst Latino and Asian Americans. And I think in Georgia, it's interesting because, you know, we often talk very much about the Black vote in Georgia. And I mean, Black voters make up like a third of the electorate. So it is huge and critical. But for these really tight races where the margins are going to be 100,000 votes, 30,000 votes, seeing the growing Asian American population in the state, seeing the growing Hispanic population in the state, and who is talking to them, who is really courting them, I think is really interesting. And because it's, again, if people, it's not just about, oh, is a Latino going to go and vote Republican? Because that obviously was like the big narrative and conversation we had leading into 2022. But it's more like, are people going to stay home? Do people feel like this affects my life? Like I need to go out and vote. And it is interesting to just see like Warnock, for example, in his runoff strategy, made a very conscious effort to be trying to engage Asian American and Latino communities, knowing that if this is going to be a tight race, then like 10,000 Latinos will make a huge difference. But I mean, when it comes to white voters, we've seen that it has not been something that, you know, white voters have shifted towards the Democratic Party in this election. I mean, there hasn't been some radical realignment necessarily, but it just shows us again that when we're talking about the investment, I think so often in the election cycles, we're saying like, well, what are Democrats doing to court like white suburban women, or what are Democrats doing to court rural voters? And I'm by no means advocating that they need to be doing one way or another. But again, who is the coalition that's helping them win? it is largely these voters of color in these states.
You know, I'm so glad that you said that because I was watching you and I were texting about this. You were on a Telemundo special talking about this was before November and the election cycle. And you said something in Spanish there. I'm not going to say it here for our English speaking audience, but you said something that resonated with a lot of people where you were hearing from Latino voters. And I don't remember. I know you filmed it in Miami, but I'm not sure if it was Florida voters that said this to you. But you said something to the effect of the Democratic Party does the same old thing. They tell me to vote for them. They don't really give me any reason. And then I'll see them in 4 years, or I'll see them in 2 years. And so with that, they feel the need to vote more Republican. You were just talking about the narrative overall. What do you make of that? Because we've seen the shift of largely Latino voters voting Democratic. I don't necessarily want to get into the Latino. I want to get more into what are the Democrats that you saw on the ground? You just mentioned Warnock was messaging the people. What were they saying? What is the messaging looking like versus the Republican messaging for specifically this campaign, but then also broadly nationally?
Yeah, I mean, for Democrats, what we saw in the ground in Georgia was Warnock saying, first of all, I'm here to listen. And it's not something that he only did in the final weeks of the election, because I think that's something that Democrats get criticized, and all candidates, not just Democrats, but get criticized for like showing up in a community a few days before an election and saying like, yeah, we really care about you, come vote for us. And kind of that pandering that we've seen happen, obviously historically with communities of color in specific. But, it was a strategy for months of, okay, who are the like surrogates that we can line up, like people that are part of this community, people that understand the needs of these communities, that can speak to what people need, that can vouch for us, that can help us send our message, can help us hear what we need to be doing better. And I feel like there was a lot of that, of the listening sessions going on amongst Democrats in Georgia with these communities. And also, I think one of the things that I thought was really unique talking to groups on the ground here was that it wasn't like, okay, we're going to have the campaign parachute in. It's like, okay, no, we're going to work with organizations that dedicate themselves to this. So Warnock, for example, did a lot with one organization in Georgia called Casa in Action. And they understand the community. So for them, for example, if I was like reaching out to the campaign to talk to them about their Latino outreach or something, or talk to them about their Asian American outreach, they would answer you, but they'd also be like, a really good resource is this group that is, that has people from this community that understand this and all of that. So I think that's an interesting thing that we're seeing a higher awareness of. I won't venture to say now that like, oh, Democrats have like figured out all their problems with like certain groups of voters or anything like that. But I do think in Georgia in specific, there was like a heightened awareness of needing to be better at that. On the Republican side, I mean, and I'll say in Walker's, campaign specifically, there just wasn't that kind of outreach to specific groups. He was very focused on like energizing like the Republican base. He was really like focused on like culture war issues that was gonna like excite and energize like the Trump voter. But he didn't ever veer off from that. So I think like people thought, okay, well, he could be trying to court more moderate Republicans who, and that would be maybe a more diverse coalition as well. But that just never happened. So he focused a lot on the anti-trans messaging. He focused a lot of the surrogates that he had come speak, we're talking about the border and about immigration and these issues that we've seen animate the Republican base, but that obviously is something that animates more of a predominantly white crowd.
All right, that's the commercial break. All right, so now the balance of the Senate is 51-49. Chuck Schumer was holding a press conference this week talking about how pivotal this is now that the Democrats hold the majority. I want you as a reporter, you're heading back to DC in a bit. You're going to be talking to members of Congress going forward. Give me tell our audience why this is so important that Democrats were able to gain this seat. Obviously, people maybe read articles and they say, okay, well, now Democrats hold it. Maybe, Manchin and Sinema won't hold up certain things. They'll have majorities in each committee. Maybe they'll have stronger power to issue subpoenas. Why was it so important for Democrats to get this advantage and have a 51-49 lead in the Senate?
mean, one thing that I'll say that was a historic, a point of history that I actually didn't know until last night, is the fact that this is the first time that an incumbent president since FDR hasn't lost a senator from his own party. So the fact that they reelected every incumbent senator already was a big deal. And Democrats are definitely touting that and very proud of that. But in just the day-to-day, what they're going to be able to get done, the fact is that the House is going to be majority Republican. So the idea that Democrats are going to get to pass all this legislation in the Senate and move it to the House and getting pieces of legislation done is difficult to see with that kind of breakdown of Congress. But Democrats were touting, like there is a huge difference between 50 and 51. Having, a 50-50 Senate with Vice President Kamala Harris being that tie-breaking vote, they've faced many challenges. For example, in kind of their power sharing agreement with Republicans in committees, they had an equal number of members. They didn't have a majority. So for example, for dealing with like judicial nominees and being able to move, or presidential executive nominees, now they will have a majority in committee to be able to vote people out of the committees and get people confirmed faster. That's a big win that they're touting. And then for them, it's also just looking to 2024. If the reality is that aside from the judicial nominees, aside from like having subpoena power, aside from just the optics of being able to say like we have that +1 majority, they know that the environment in 2024, with the number of Senate seats that will be up for re-election, that it's going to be a tough environment for them. So for them to already have baked in that +1 is something that they're touting a lot, and that if there is the opportunities to get something done, they won't have to worry as much about Sinema and Manchin, as you mentioned. I mean, if there is something to get done, they have a little bit of breathing room and a cushion to push the president's agenda.
Yeah. What are some of those? I just thought of this because I want to get into 2024. You just fed in perfectly into the follow-up. But what are some of those things that you've maybe heard from either Democratic strategists or even people that are on the Hill, congressional folks? What are some of the things that they're looking to get done? Is it just strictly nominees and committees and things like that? What are some pieces of legislation that the Democrats that haven't already gotten it passed, right? It's some major bills that have been passed this past year. What are some things that they do want to do?
And one of the big ones that they consistently talk about is ways to lower healthcare costs. I mean, that's something that Democrats have talked about consistently over the years. I heard Warnock talk about it time and time again. For him, like one of the big issues is being able to pass legislation that would cap the cost of insulin. I know that that's like a passion project for Warnock specifically, but it does speak to some of the larger, broader Democratic priorities that we hear. So I think seeing where they'll be able to do anything on that front having to do with healthcare is something that we could be eyeing. One of the failures of the Senate over the past 2 years and for Democrats was they had talked very much about getting done voting rights legislation. And some folks already were talking today about, okay, we need to make a concerted push to get something passed. Again, there's always the question around like the filibuster and if they would be willing to pass something with a simple majority instead of the 60 votes passed. I think there's still lots of barriers to getting anything done, but I think, voting rights is one that we could be hearing them, pick up again and have debates around again. Now, again, will it actually get done? Is a real open question. But again, it is one that like we today are already hearing folks talk about.
It's so funny. I mean, you probably know this better than me as just somebody who's been covering Congress and then obviously writing about things like this and talking to voters. But it's almost like a new season of White Lotus, right? Like you're just waiting to see what happens in this season of On the Hill. But from last season, not much got done. Not no storylines were really close. Although White Lotus is probably a bad example because it's an anthology series. But like, do you get what I'm saying here? Like, do you ever feel like that where Congress is like your favorite series and like they didn't close some of the loopholes from the previous season and now they're coming into this season and then you wasted 7 episodes. Now you're at the finale. They made it really good. And then they leave you on a cliffhanger. And now we're going into the next season. Am I way off base here, Sabrina?
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, that's kind of one of the frustrations that, and all my respect to Hill reporters that do it on the day to day, because again, like we have lots of conversations about like, okay, well, oh, they're debating X bill, or oh, they're considering passing X thing, and it's like nobody says the quiet part out loud, which is the like, is it ever actually going to get done?
Right.
And I hate to be like so cynical about it, but I do think that there is a valid frustration um, inside Washington, and I will say nationally. I mean, I think there's like an actual national question, like voters asking, like, I keep going out to vote for someone that says they're going to do X thing, and it never happens. And yeah, that's something that I always am fascinated with, because I think it's something that like politicians in DC really need to grapple with. It's like we keep promising these things, and then it doesn't happen for one reason or another, but it doesn't. So how do you keep going back and promising the same thing?
Well, I know this election cycle just ended, but we were talking in a previous episode about 2024. I alluded to it at the top of the show, a tough week for the guy who potentially will be the GOP frontrunner, the former President Donald Trump. Obviously, his organization this week was found guilty of tax fraud, about 17 counts at the state Supreme Court in Manhattan this past week, receiving luxury apartments, leased Mercedes Benzes, extra cash at Christmas, even free cable television. They should send that over my way. I need some. And then the Trump search team, he has an actual team right now that is still searching for some of the classified documents to comply with the special counsel. They found at least 2 classified documents outside of Mar-a-Lago that were at a West Palm Beach storage unit that's being used by the former president. These items were turned into the FBI. Obviously, the FBI and the DOJ are still investigating that with the former president. I say all that to say to you, putting a prognosticator hat on in 2024, I can't imagine you're not going to be on the ground covering some of this. Who is the front runner? I mean, who will be the eventual GOP nominee for 2024 for president? And then on the Democratic side, President Biden, 38% approval rating right now as of this taping. Who is the Democratic nominee? Sabrina Rodriguez. We're going to play the tape on November, whenever it is, 8th of 2024. We're going to come back to it. Give us Sabrina Rodriguez's prognostication here.
You know that I am not going to give a Sabrina Rodriguez prognostication, but I will say what we've heard from GOP strategists and from Democratic leaders and strategists so far. And I mean, one of the things that has been the most interesting in the fallout from the election has been kind of the conversation of people, Republicans becoming increasingly comfortable coming out and talking against former President Trump. I think prior to the election and what the results were then, there was a big question around, for months. I mean, there's been a question of, okay, is Trump going to run again? And if he does run again, is there anyone that's going to run against him? How many people are going to run against him? Are people going to shy away from it? I mean, there's been all these questions around what's going to happen. I think there's still several questions to really have answered here, but as we see more people growing comfortable and saying like, we need to invest in the future of the party. Donald Trump is not the future of the party, because that is something we've been hearing more Republicans say, some on the record, some still on background, but them saying there is that question, who is the other person? Polling shows, and something that I have heard consistently also just talking to voters on the ground, is that person would be Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. He has been talked about. I mean, his victory in Florida and him, helping kind of write this narrative of Florida having moved from being a battleground state to now being a Republican state, that he's kind of doing his victory lap around, has really put him in a position where people think of him as like this national leader, this figure that could actually run for president and could win in 2024. So he's kind of viewed as the front runner, but there's still conversations around like many people piling into the race, people like former Vice President Mike Pence, former UN ambassador and former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley, people like former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. I mean, there's a long list of Republicans that have, signaled interest in running for president that could be announcing. But again, the person that in polling and in conversations is coming up more and more is DeSantis. And then on the Democratic side, I would say, I think actually the way that the results in November have hurt Trump in his prospects and in people kind of rallying around him as the next Republican nominee. It's the opposite on the Democratic side, where there were sort of these questions around, would someone challenge Biden? Should someone challenge Biden? Is he going to run again? What's the move for Democrats? I think the results and them having been much better than expected for Democrats has actually quieted down some of that, where people are saying, yeah, Biden's going to run again. And there isn't really a front runner or a face of someone yet, at least that would challenge the president.
Before I let you go, Sabrina, because you've done such a great job. You and I are both Florida. Well, I'm a Florida resident. You're a DC resident, but a Florida native. You have so many people in your family that go to the polls here in Florida. Likewise for me. On the last episode, I was talking with Rick Sanchez about this. Obviously, Rick, longtime anchor down here at WSVN in Miami. He thinks DeSantis translates perfectly nationally because of, the culture wars and how well DeSantis plays it. And he kind of teeters on this, I'm not really racist, but check this out, type of policy. I don't know if that translates nationally, but what says you as somebody that knows Florida politics well? Do you think Ron DeSantis actually translates nationally and could be president of the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I think just from seeing his playbook and I guess, yeah, we have like that insider knowledge being from Florida, but then also just paying attention to national politics. It does seem that he has kind of built a playbook in Florida that he wants to export to other states. I mean, even seeing like some of the efforts that he made leading up to the general election, he felt very comfortable that he was going to win in Florida. So he focused on kind of how would he message what he was doing nationally. And I think a lot of the efforts that he's made, whether it was passing the parental rights and education bill and him, talking about a lot of the culture war issues, has been kind of, Florida has been sort of the guinea pig for, okay, what are the things that can end up actually being really popular? Or what are the things that could end up really energizing Republicans? I think of also, the flight of Venezuelan migrants to Martha's Vineyard, sort of as that, like, okay, what are these things that could animate the base, and just sort of him testing out what works and seeing the popularity that he's built in Florida, and Florida being a diverse state. I mean, Florida being a state, obviously, with so many Latinos, with, older white retired folks, with, having large cities, more rural areas. I mean, seeing, Florida gets talked about obviously as being, like, oh man, Florida and how unique it is, but Florida does have a really mixed bag of people that he has been able to kind of test out policies and rhetoric and his demeanor on during his time as governor.
Unique is a very good word there. I know that's not the word you meant to say, but my thank yous to Sabrina Rodriguez for being on the program. You were a fantastic fill-in guest host here for Nick Savary. Wish we could fill her in a little bit more than Nick Savary, but nobody heard that. Sabrina, continued success to you. Safe travels back to DC and all the great work that you did this election cycle, covering everything in Georgia. I wish you continued success. You know that, and you're welcome on the program anytime.
Thanks so much for having me. It was fun. We miss Nick, though.
We do. Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.